Tonight, we're descending into Silent Hill not to catalog its monsters or map its fog-shrouded streets, but to diagnose the minds that wander through them. This isn't a list of creatures or a timeline of hauntings. This is a clinical journey through the psychological disorders that make Silent Hill's horror feel so devastatingly real. From depression and PTSD to dissociative disorders and psychosis, the characters who enter this town carry diagnoses written in their traumas, their behaviors, their breakdowns. And Silent Hill, that cruel therapist wrapped in fog, forces each of them to confront what they've been running from. This isn't about armchair psychology or reducing complex characters to clinical labels. This is about understanding how Team Silent and later developers crafted protagonists and supporting casts whose mental health struggles are portrayed with uncomfortable authenticity. These aren't just horror game characters screaming at jump scares. They're individuals whose psychological wounds manifest as literal monsters, whose depression warps architecture into rust and decay, whose trauma creates worlds that burn or freeze or bleed. Let's examine every major character across the franchise, identify the mental health conditions they exhibit, and explore how the games use psychiatric reality to create their most effective horror. Understanding the mind's breaking points. Mental disorders as horror foundation. Before we catalog the specific diagnoses haunting Silent Hill's fog, we need to understand what mental disorders actually are, how they function in reality, and why Team Silent's decision to center their horror around authentic psychological suffering was both revolutionary and profoundly unsettling. Because mental illness isn't what most horror games or films have traditionally portrayed. It's not dramatic screaming in padded rooms. It's not split personalities with names and elaborate backstories. And it's certainly not the excuse for why the killer wears a mask and murders teenagers. Mental disorders are, at their most fundamental level, patterns of thinking, feeling, and behaving that cause significant distress or impairment in functioning. They're diagnosed conditions with specific criteria, documented symptom clusters that mental health professionals use to identify and treat psychological suffering. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, contains hundreds of these conditions, each with precise definitions. Major depressive disorder requires at least 5 specific symptoms present for at least 2 weeks. Post-traumatic stress disorder needs exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, plus intrusive symptoms, avoidance behaviors, negative alterations in cognition and mood, and marked changes in arousal and reactivity. These aren't vague feelings of sadness or nervousness. They're quantifiable, consistent patterns that researchers have documented across millions of patients over decades of study. When someone has major depression, their brain chemistry has measurably changed. Serotonin and norepinephrine systems aren't functioning normally. When someone develops PTSD, their amygdala becomes hyperactive while their hippocampus shrinks, creating a neurological state of constant threat detection. These are medical conditions with biological underpinnings, not character flaws or moral failings. But here's what makes mental illness particularly suited to horror. It attacks from inside. Cancer is terrifying because it's your own cells betraying you, but you can locate a tumor, target it with treatment, conceive of it as a foreign invader to be eliminated. Mental disorders are your own thoughts, emotions, and perceptions betraying you. The call is coming from inside the house, except the house is your skull, and there's nowhere to run. When depression tells you that you're worthless, and everyone would be better off without you, that's your own brain generating those thoughts. When PTSD makes you experience flashbacks so vivid, they feel like the traumatic event is happening again right now. That's your own memory system malfunctioning. When psychosis creates hallucinations of people who aren't there, that's your own sensory processing creating false input. You can't trust your own mind. That's the core horror of mental illness. And it's more frightening than any external monster because you carry it everywhere, can't fight it with weapons, can't run from it, and often can't even identify it as separate from yourself. Depression doesn't feel like an illness attacking you. It feels like finally seeing the truth about how terrible everything really is. Anxiety doesn't feel like a malfunction. It feels like appropriate response to genuine danger. Psychotic delusions don't feel false. They feel more real than anything else you've ever experienced. Traditional horror media has historically handled mental illness poorly, often offensively. The psycho killer trope presents mentally ill individuals as violent threats, despite statistics showing that people with mental illness are far more likely to be victims of violence than perpetrators. The split personality trope sensationalizes dissociative identity disorder into something cinematic and frightening rather than the traumatic survival mechanism it actually is. Asylums and psychiatric hospitals are treated as spooky settings full of crazy people whose suffering is aesthetic rather than human. This approach stigmatizes actual mental illness, makes people suffering from real conditions reluctant to seek help for fear of being viewed as dangerous or unpredictable, and treats complex psychological conditions as shallow narrative devices. Silent Hill arrived in 1999 and did something radically different. Instead of making mental illness the source of external threat, the slasher with schizophrenia, the murderer with psychosis, it made mental illness the lens through which horror is experienced. The protagonists aren't threatened by mentally ill villains. They're experiencing psychological conditions themselves, and those conditions shape what they perceive, how they interpret events, and ultimately whether they survive or succumb. The town of Silent Hill functions as a psychological amplifier. It takes internal suffering and makes it external. James Sunderland's depression and guilt don't just make him feel bad. They manifest as Pyramid Head, as Maria dying repeatedly, as monsters that embody his specific psychological conflicts. Angela Roscoe's trauma from childhood sexual abuse doesn't just cause flashbacks. It literally sets her world on fire, creating an environment that reflects her internal state of constant burning. The genius of this approach is that it makes mental illness central to the horror without demonizing it. The characters aren't scary because they're mentally ill. They're sympathetic because their mental illness is being weaponized against them by supernatural forces. This framework allows Team Silent to portray psychiatric symptoms with uncomfortable accuracy while maintaining the supernatural horror elements that make the games engaging. When James exhibits the flat affect and emotional numbness of severe depression, it's not exposition, it's characterization through behavior. When Angela dissociates in the mirror room, we're watching an actual dissociative episode rather than a dramatic performance of craziness. When Eddie's paranoia escalates from nervous defensiveness to delusional persecution, we're tracking a realistic deterioration rather than sudden insanity. The horror emerges from recognition. Players who've experienced depression recognize James' hollow movements, his monotone voice, his inability to care even when circumstances demand reaction. Players who've experienced trauma recognize Angela's hypervigilance, her reflexive apologies, her inability to accept comfort. The games are frightening not despite their psychological realism, but because of it. They show us the monsters we carry inside, the ways our own minds can become our worst enemies, the terrifying fragility of the reality we construct to function day by day. Silent Hill also demonstrates how mental illness isolates. Each character in Silent Hill 2 is trapped in their own personal hell, seeing different manifestations based on their specific psychological wounds. James doesn't see Angela's fire. Angela doesn't see James's pyramid head. They're physically proximate but psychologically unreachable, a perfect metaphor for how mental illness creates loneliness, even in crowded rooms. You can be surrounded by people and still feel completely alone because no one can actually access your internal experience, can't see the monsters you're fighting, can't understand the specific texture of your suffering. This isolation is clinically accurate. Depression creates cognitive distortions that convince you no one would understand, that you're uniquely broken, that reaching out would burden others. PTSD creates hypervigilance that makes trust impossible, ensuring you remain emotionally distant even from people trying to help. Psychotic disorders create experiences so bizarre that explaining them risks being dismissed or disbelieved. Mental illness builds walls, and Silent Hill literalizes those walls into environments where each character is fundamentally alone, despite occasionally crossing paths. The games also show how mental illness resists simple resolution. There's no moment where James takes medication and feels better. There's no therapy session where Angela processes her trauma and heals. The characters either learn to live with their conditions, integration rather than cure, or they're destroyed by them. This reflects the reality that many mental health conditions are chronic, manageable but not erasable, requiring ongoing effort rather than one-time fixes. The Leave ending for James isn't him being cured of depression. It's him accepting responsibility, choosing to keep living despite the guilt, finding meaning sufficient to outweigh the pain. That's what recovery often looks like. Not the absence of symptoms, but the ability to function despite them. Silent Hill's approach to mental illness as horror mechanism rather than horror source revolutionized psychological horror in gaming. It showed that you could create profound unease not through jump scares or gore, but through authentic portrayal of psychological suffering, through making players inhabit minds that are wounded and malfunctioning, through demonstrating how reality itself becomes unreliable when you can't trust your own perception. The series teaches us that the most effective horror is personal, internal, inescapable. External threats can be fought or fled. Internal threats follow you everywhere, shape everything you experience, and offer no clear victory condition. When your enemy is your own broken brain, every battle is fought on compromised ground, using weapons that might not be real against opponents that might be you. This is why we're examining these characters diagnostically, not to reduce them to clinical labels, but to understand how Team Silent used authentic psychiatric presentations to create horror that resonates beyond the screen. These characters suffer from recognizable conditions with documented symptoms, and that recognition is what makes their stories genuinely frightening rather than merely startling. We fear for them because we understand their illnesses are real, their suffering is meaningful, and their fates demonstrate what happens when psychological wounds remain untreated until they consume everything. Now let's meet the patients. James Sunderland, The Architecture of Guilt. We begin with the most analyzed character in the franchise, though that analysis is richly deserved. James Sunderland arrives in Silent Hill carrying what appears on the surface to be grief. His wife Mary died 3 years ago from a terminal illness, and he's received an impossible letter claiming she's waiting for him in their special place. But as the town peels back his defenses layer by layer, we discover James is exhibiting symptoms consistent with major depressive disorder with psychotic features, complicated by severe post-traumatic stress disorder, stemming from an act he's repressed so completely that he's reconstructed his entire personal history around a lie. Let's start with the depression. James exhibits nearly every diagnostic criterion from the DSM. His affect is flattened. Watch him move through the game and notice how little emotional variation he shows, even when confronted with horrific sights. His speech is monotone, his movements are lethargic, and he describes a persistent sense of emptiness and detachment. When he encounters Angela or Eddie, both clearly in crisis, his responses are muted, almost disinterested. This isn't callousness, it's anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure or emotional connection that characterizes severe depression. The psychotic features manifest in his inability to distinguish between memory and delusion. James constructed a false timeline where Mary died 3 years ago, when evidence throughout the game, hospital records, Laura's testimony, the videotape in room 312, reveals she died far more recently, perhaps only months or weeks before his arrival in Silent Hill. This isn't simple denial. James has experienced a psychotic break that allowed him to literally rewrite his personal history, a dissociative mechanism his mind employed to protect him from the guilt of what he did. He murdered Mary by smothering her with a pillow. The PTSD diagnosis comes from how James experiences traumatic intrusions. Pyramid Head, that executioner wearing the helmet from Silent Hill's historical paintings, isn't just a monster, it's James's trauma made physical. PTSD often involves re-experiencing traumatic events through intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, or nightmares. James re-experiences his guilt through Pyramid Head's repeated executions of Maria, forcing him to witness Mary's death over and over in symbolic form. The creature's sexual violence toward other monsters reflects James's shame over his sexual frustration during Mary's illness, a common but deeply guilt-inducing response among caregivers of terminally ill spouses. Maria herself represents a dissociative symptom. She's not a separate person, but a manifestation of James's fragmented psyche, specifically his desire for Mary without the burden of her illness. She dresses provocatively, acts flirtatiously, and represents everything Mary couldn't be during her final months. When Maria dies repeatedly and resurrects, she's demonstrating the obsessive cycle of James's thoughts, wanting Mary back, feeling guilty for wanting her differently, punishing himself with her death, and beginning the cycle again. This is intrusive ideation, a hallmark of both PTSD and obsessive compulsive disorder. The three patients James reads about in Brookhaven Hospital, Jack Davis, Joseph Barkin, and Joshua Lewis, all have names starting with J, and their symptoms mirror different aspects of James's fractured psyche. Jack represents the suicidal ideation. Joseph embodies the guilt and delusional thinking. Joshua personifies the violent impulse and need for punishment. These aren't coincidental names, they're James's mind fragmenting, a dissociative symptom where different aspects of personality become separated and perceived as distinct. This occurs in severe trauma when the integrated self cannot process the magnitude of what happened. James's physical presentation reinforces the depression diagnosis. He looks exhausted, moves as though wading through water, and his combat style is hesitant and unpracticed. Not because he's untrained, but because he doesn't care if he gets hurt. This is passive suicidal ideation, where someone doesn't actively plan to end their life, but wouldn't mind if circumstances did it for them. The in-water ending, where James drives into Toluca Lake with Mary's body, represents this ideation becoming active. The leave ending suggests some degree of recovery, while the Maria ending shows him replacing his trauma with a new obsession, trading one pathological attachment for another rather than healing. The game's ending system brilliantly diagnoses James through player behavior. If you maintain low health, examine items related to Mary's death frequently, and listen to her messages repeatedly. The game interprets this as depressive rumination and delivers the in-water ending. If you protect Maria, keep James healthy, and check on Maria regularly, the game reads this as replacement behavior and delivers the Maria ending. The game is functioning as a psychological assessment tool, measuring the players and by extension James's mental state through gameplay choices rather than dialogue options. What makes James's portrayal so effective is how it avoids sensationalism. His depression isn't dramatic or performative. He's not constantly crying or shouting about his pain. Instead, he's hollow, going through motions, speaking in a voice that rarely rises or falls, exhibiting the quiet devastation of someone who's already dead inside and is just waiting for his body to catch up. The horror isn't in the monsters. It's in recognizing that emptiness, that specific quality of depression where you're not sad exactly, just absent, going through the mechanics of existence without actually being present in your own life. Angela Orozco, Trauma Without Resolution. If James represents depression and PTSD from a single devastating act, Angela Orozco embodies complex post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from chronic, inescapable abuse. We meet her in a cemetery, searching for her mother, and every subsequent encounter reveals more layers of a psyche shattered by years of physical and sexual abuse from her father and brother, with her mother's complicity adding betrayal to the violence. Complex PTSD differs from standard PTSD in crucial ways. It develops from prolonged, repeated trauma, especially trauma that occurs in childhood and involves caretakers. Angela exhibits all the diagnostic criteria: emotional dysregulation, negative self-concept, interpersonal difficulties, and persistent feelings of shame and guilt. When we first meet her, she's scanning tombstones with a dissociated affect, barely registering James's presence. Her speech is halting, punctuated with apologies. "I'm sorry" becomes her refrain, the verbal tick of someone conditioned to believe their existence requires constant apology. The dissociation is Angela's most prominent symptom. In their second meeting, James finds her in a room of mirrors, holding a knife, and she can't remember how she got there or what she planned to do. This is a dissociative fugue state, where traumatic triggers cause temporary amnesia and detachment from reality. Angela's abuse was so severe that her mind developed this escape mechanism. When overwhelmed, she simply disappears from her own consciousness. This isn't a choice or a dramatic gesture. It's an involuntary neurological response to trauma that exceeded her capacity to process. Her physical appearance tells its own diagnostic story. Angela is 19 years old but looks significantly older, weathered in ways that have nothing to do with genetics and everything to do with stress hormones flooding her system since childhood. Chronic trauma physically ages its victims through what's called allostatic load, the wear and tear on the body from chronic stress. Her baggy eyes, her exhausted posture, even her choice of clothing that covers her entire body, all speak to someone carrying trauma in their flesh. The abstract daddy encounter provides the clearest window into Angela's psychological damage. This creature, two figures merged on a bed frame, the larger body pinning down the smaller, is a literalization of her sexual abuse. But notice how the game frames it. Angela isn't just haunted by her father's actions. She's haunted by her participation in them, by the shame and self-blame that abuse victims frequently experience. The monster doesn't just represent Thomas Orozco, it represents the act itself and Angela's internalized belief that she somehow deserved it or caused it. This self-blame is a diagnostic feature of complex PTSD. Angela repeats her mother's words, "Even Mama said it, I deserved what happened," demonstrating how abuse victims internalize their abusers' narratives. Her mother told her the abuse was her fault, a gaslighting technique that shifts responsibility from perpetrator to victim. Years of hearing this created a core belief that shaped Angela's entire self-concept. She is fundamentally bad, fundamentally deserving of pain. This isn't just low self-esteem, it's a pervasive sense of being irredeemably corrupted, a symptom clinicians call toxic shame. Angela's interpersonal difficulties manifest in her interactions with James. She's simultaneously desperate for connection and terrified of it. When James reaches toward her shoulder in their first meeting, she recoils, apologizes, then catches herself and tries to act normal. A rapid cycle of fear, appeasement, and forced composure that exhausts her. She misreads benign gestures as threats because her threat detection system is hyperactive, seeing danger everywhere. This hypervigilance is a PTSD symptom that in Angela's case has been calibrated by years of actual danger, making it nearly impossible for her to distinguish between safe and unsafe situations. The fire that surrounds Angela in her final scene isn't just visual metaphor, it's her perception of reality. "You see it too? For me, it's always like this," she tells James, revealing that she lives in a constant state of psychological burning. This is emotional flashback, where past trauma intrudes so completely into the present that the person experiences it as current reality. Angela isn't metaphorically on fire. Experientially, she is burning all the time, and has been since childhood. Her ascent up the burning staircase is simultaneously suicide and escape, an acknowledgement that she can't live in a world that feels like it's incinerating her moment by moment. What separates Angela's portrayal from typical abuse survivor depictions is the game's refusal to offer her redemption or healing. James can't save her. His attempts to comfort her fail not because he's inadequate, but because her damage runs too deep for a stranger's kindness to reach. The game demonstrates the hard truth that trauma of this magnitude often doesn't have tidy resolutions. Some people don't heal. Some wounds are too fundamental. Angela walks into the fire not because she's weak, but because living requires resources she no longer has. Her diagnosis would likely include major depressive disorder alongside the complex PTSD, possibly with suicidal features. The knife she contemplates, the fire she enters, the persistent death wish that colors all her interactions. These aren't dramatic gestures, but the logical conclusion of a psyche that's been in pain for so long that ending becomes the only conceivable relief. She killed her father and brother not in heroic self-defense, but in desperate, messy survival. And that act, rather than freeing her, added guilt to her already crushing burden of shame. Eddie Dombrowski, The Paranoid Projection. Eddie Dombrowski presents a case study in how chronic bullying and social trauma can create paranoid thinking that devolves into violence. Unlike James's guilt or Angela's abuse survival, Eddie's disorder manifests as a persecution complex with psychotic features. He genuinely believes everyone is mocking him, and Silent Hill amplifies that belief until he can no longer distinguish between actual ridicule and imagined insult. We first meet Eddie vomiting in a toilet, having just discovered a corpse in a refrigerator. His immediate defensive posture, "I didn't do it," reveals someone accustomed to being accused, someone whose first instinct is protestation of innocence even before being questioned. This hyper-defensiveness is a symptom of paranoid personality disorder, where individuals interpret neutral or benign actions as threatening or humiliating. Eddie's entire life has been shaped by being mocked for his weight, creating a persistent belief that others are always judging him negatively. The progression of Eddie's interactions with James tracks a deterioration from nervous friendliness to open hostility. Initially, Eddie tries to present as non-threatening, even apologetic, but each encounter shows him interpreting James's behavior as mockery. By their final meeting in the prison's meat locker, Eddie has constructed an entire narrative where James has been laughing at him behind his back the whole time, despite no evidence of this. This is paranoid ideation becoming delusional. Eddie's mind is creating persecution where none exists because his trauma has wired him to expect ridicule in every interaction. The corpses that appear in Eddie's scenes are crucial diagnostic evidence. According to the game's art director, Eddie only killed a dog and shot his bully in the knee. The other bodies are hallucinations, products of his psychotic break. This means Eddie is experiencing visual hallucinations that reinforce his persecutory beliefs. Each corpse represents someone he imagines mocking him, and in his delusional state, he believes he's killed them in justified retaliation. This combination of paranoid delusions and hallucinations suggests either brief psychotic disorder triggered by stress or early-stage paranoid schizophrenia. Eddie's backstory reveals the environmental factors that created his disorder. Years of bullying about his weight, continuing even after high school graduation, created a wound that never healed. The bullying wasn't just verbal, but social. His sense of being excluded, laughed at, and diminished became his core identity. When he finally snapped and killed the bully's dog, then shot the bully, it wasn't sudden violence from nowhere. It was the culmination of years of accumulated humiliation transforming into rage. Silent Hill exacerbates Eddie's paranoia by manifesting his fears. The meat locker where you fight him is filled with hanging carcasses and freezing fog, creating an environment where he can project his persecution complex onto literal monsters and enemies. The voices he hears mocking him may be actual environmental sounds, may be hallucinations, or may be Silent Hill's supernatural influence. But from Eddie's subjective experience, they're all equally real and equally threatening. What makes Eddie's portrayal uncomfortable is how it demonstrates that victimhood doesn't guarantee innocence. Eddie was genuinely bullied. His suffering was real. But instead of developing empathy from that suffering, he developed sadism. He describes enjoying the sound of his bully crying after being shot, enjoying the power that came from inflicting pain. This transformation from victim to victimizer is clinically documented in individuals with certain personality disorders. The suffering doesn't create compassion, but instead creates a desire to make others feel the same pain. The diagnosis here is complex. Eddie likely has major depressive disorder stemming from chronic social rejection. The paranoid thinking could be a symptom of that depression, or could indicate a separate paranoid personality disorder. The psychotic features, hallucinations, and delusions might be stress-induced or might represent an emerging psychotic disorder like schizophrenia. His violence isn't impulsive but ideation-driven. He's thought extensively about killing people who laugh at him, has fantasized about it, and Silent Hill gives him the justification and opportunity to act on those fantasies. James's confrontation with Eddie forces both characters to face uncomfortable truths. For Eddie, it's that his persecution isn't as universal as he believes. James genuinely wasn't mocking him. For James, it's a mirror of his own capacity for violence. When James kills Eddie in the meat locker, it's self-defense, but it's also an acknowledgement that James too has killed someone, that the line between justified violence and murder is thinner than he wants to believe. Walter Sullivan, Attachment Disorder and Psychotic Delusion. Walter Sullivan represents one of the most severe cases of mental illness in the franchise, combining reactive attachment disorder from infancy, psychotic disorder with religious delusions, and behaviors consistent with antisocial personality disorder. Abandoned in room 302 immediately after birth, Walter's first experience of the world was absolute neglect. No parental bonding, no secure attachment, just abandonment in an empty apartment. Attachment disorder develops when infants don't form healthy bonds with caregivers. The condition creates lifelong difficulties with relationships, emotional regulation, and reality testing. Walter's belief that room 302 is his mother isn't poetic metaphor. It's a genuine delusion stemming from attachment disorder. Unable to form a healthy bond with a human caregiver, infant Walter's developing brain attached to the only constant in his environment, the room itself. This attachment became the foundation of his entire psychological structure. When Walter was moved to Wish House Orphanage, he was indoctrinated into the order's belief system, adding religious delusions to his existing attachment disorder. The cult taught him that he was chosen to perform the 21 Sacraments ritual, that his murders would purify the world and resurrect his mother. In a neurotypical child, cult indoctrination is damaging, but the child retains some connection to reality. In Walter, who already had a psychotic attachment to a room, the cult's teachings found fertile ground. The delusions weren't imposed on a healthy mind. They filled the emptiness where healthy psychological structures should have developed. The 21 Sacraments murders demonstrate organized psychotic behavior. Walter murdered 10 people methodically, removing their hearts, carving numbers into their bodies, and leaving his name as a signature. The absence of forensic evidence, no fingerprints, no fibers, suggests either supernatural assistance or such profound association that he operated in an altered state that didn't leave normal traces. The ritualistic nature indicates not impulsive violence but delusional conviction that these murders were necessary religious acts. Walter's suicide, stabbing himself in the neck with a spoon to sever his carotid artery, shows both the depth of his delusion and his ability to inflict extreme violence on himself. This wasn't a moment of despair, but a calculated ritual step, the ritual of the Holy Assumption, where he made himself the 11th victim while believing he would continue to exist spiritually to complete the remaining murders. The conviction required to do this suggests psychotic disorder with complete loss of reality testing. Walter genuinely believed he would continue after death. The other worlds Walter creates demonstrate his internal psychological landscape. They're not random nightmares, but specific manifestations of his childhood traumas and current delusions. The hospital world reflects his time in medical institutions after abandonment. The forest world represents Wish House, where he was abused and indoctrinated. The water prison world symbolizes both the cult's punishment methods and the amniotic symbolism tied to his fixation on birth and motherhood. These aren't just scary locations, they're Walter's psyche made architectural. The ghosts that pursue Henry throughout the game are Walter's victims, but from a psychiatric perspective, they're also Walter's compulsive need to complete the ritual, manifesting as harassment and attack. The fact that they're immortal, they cannot be permanently killed, only temporarily immobilized, reflects how intrusive thoughts in psychotic disorders cannot be reasoned away or defeated, only managed. The ghosts are Walter's obsession made external and unstoppable. Walter's delusion about room 302 being his mother demonstrates severe reality distortion. He speaks to the room, believes it loves him, and perceives his murders as gifts to it. This isn't anthropomorphization of a cherished place. It's genuine belief in the room's personhood and maternal nature. The psychological term for this is psychotic transference. His need for maternal attachment transferred onto an inanimate space, and his psychosis made that transfer feel completely real. The diagnosis here would include reactive attachment disorder, psychotic disorder with religious and somatic delusions, and likely antisocial personality disorder given his complete lack of empathy for victims. Walter doesn't kill out of anger or sadism, but out of delusional conviction that the murders are necessary and righteous. To him, victims aren't people with their own humanity. They're components of a ritual, sacrificial elements required for a higher purpose. This ability to completely dehumanize others while maintaining internal justification is characteristic of both psychotic disorders and personality disorders with antisocial features. The tragedy of Walter is that his attachment disorder was preventable. Had he been found hours rather than days after his parents abandoned him, had he received proper psychiatric treatment in childhood rather than cult indoctrination, the 21 Sacraments murders might never have occurred. Instead, his mental illness was identified by the order as useful, cultivated rather than treated, and weaponized into a tool for their apocalyptic theology. Heather Mason, Cheryl, The Burden of Inherited Trauma. Heather Mason enters Silent Hill 3 believing she's a normal 17-year-old with a somewhat overprotective father. The revelation that she's actually Cheryl, the reincarnation of Alessa Gillespie, whose soul split during the first game's events, creates a unique psychological situation. Heather carries the trauma of a life she didn't consciously live. This manifests as what might be called genetic or transferred PTSD, trauma memories that surface without direct experience of the traumatic events. Throughout the game, Heather experiences flashbacks and nightmares that belong to Alessa, not to her 17 years of normal life as Cheryl. She sees memories of being burned in the ritual, of hospital rooms and medical torture, of the cult's manipulation. These aren't false memories or imagined scenarios. They're genuine traumatic memories from Alessa's experience that are neurologically encoded in Heather's mind despite her conscious self having no direct experience of them. This phenomenon parallels documented cases of genetic trauma where descendants of trauma survivors exhibit PTSD symptoms from events they didn't personally experience. When Harry Mason is murdered by Claudia's monster, Heather's response is pure acute stress reaction. She finds her father dead in his chair and experiences immediate trauma symptoms, shock, disbelief, racing heartbeat, tunnel vision, and then rapidly mounting rage. The game shows her transition from normal teenager to someone consumed by need for vengeance, demonstrating how acute trauma can catalyze dormant psychological material. Alessa's rage, dormant in Heather's psyche, erupts fully when Harry, the only stable attachment figure in her current identity, is taken from her. The hatred that Claudia needs to make the god within Heather mature is not manufactured. It's activated. Heather already carried Alessa's trauma-born rage. Harry's death gave it permission to surface. The transformation isn't possession but integration, the Cheryl identity merging with the Alessa identity under conditions of extreme stress. This is similar to how dissociative identity disorder functions when trauma causes personality fragmentation, except in Heather's case, the fragments come from an actual previous life rather than just previous developmental stages. Heather exhibits symptoms of identity disturbance, a core feature of borderline personality disorder and dissociative disorders. She struggles throughout the game to understand who she is. Is she Cheryl? Is she Alessa? Is she Heather, a construct created by Alessa's split soul and Harry's parenting? This identity confusion isn't adolescent uncertainty, but fundamental uncertainty about which memories belong to her, which emotions are hers, and whether her sense of self is even coherent. When she encounters the memory of Alessa Boss, she's literally fighting her own fragmented identity, trying to integrate two selves that have incompatible histories. The physical manifestation of the God growing inside Heather represents what clinically might be called intrusive ideation made literal. She doesn't want the cult's deity gestating within her, didn't consent to it, and experiences it as violation and contamination. This mirrors how intrusive thoughts in OCD or PTSD feel. Unwanted mental content that invades consciousness without permission and creates overwhelming distress. The aglaophatus that Heather uses to vomit out the God is pharmaceutical intervention, similar to how medication can interrupt intrusive thought patterns in actual psychiatric treatment. Heather's portrayal demonstrates resilience alongside pathology. Despite carrying Alessa's trauma and experiencing acute trauma from Harry's death, she maintains enough ego strength to complete her mission, resist total fragmentation, and ultimately choose her identity. In the game's ending, she asks to be called Cheryl, reclaiming the identity Harry gave her while acknowledging the Alessa component. This integration, accepting both histories without being consumed by either, represents successful trauma resolution that many characters in the franchise never achieve. The diagnosis here would include complex PTSD from inherited trauma, acute stress disorder from Harry's murder, and identity disturbance requiring assessment for dissociative disorder. However, Heather demonstrates remarkable psychological flexibility and resilience, suggesting that despite the pathology present, her fundamental personality structure remains intact and functional. She's wounded but not broken, traumatized but not destroyed. Alessa Gillespie, The Architecture of Pure Suffering. While Heather carries Alessa's trauma secondhand, the original Alessa experienced suffering so extreme that her psyche literally rewrote reality. Burned alive in a cult ritual at age 7, kept alive through supernatural means while her body remained in constant agony for 7 years, and forced to gestate a god within her prepubescent body against her will. Alessa's psychology is nearly incomprehensible because her suffering exceeded what human psychology is designed to process. Alessa's creation of the otherworld isn't conscious choice but involuntary response to unbearable reality. When reality is constant torture, the mind creates alternate realities as escape. The rust, blood, chain link, and industrial horror that characterizes Silent Hill's otherworld are Alessa's pain given architectural form. The world burned her. She burned the world. The cult made her body a prison. She made the town a prison. This is dissociation on a cosmic scale. Her consciousness couldn't exist in her burned body, so it expanded outward, infecting the town's reality with her internal state. From a psychological standpoint, Alessa might be diagnosed with catatonia, a state where the mind retreats so completely from unbearable circumstances that the body becomes immobile and unresponsive. Except in Alessa's case, her catatonia is active rather than passive. Her conscious mind is withdrawn, yes, but her unconscious is projecting outward with destructive force. The monsters that hunt through Silent Hill aren't created deliberately. They're her pain and fear made flesh, automatic projections from a psyche too damaged to maintain normal boundaries between self and environment. The split of Alessa's soul that creates Cheryl is a dissociative act of profound desperation. Unable to end her suffering through death, Alessa fragments her identity, sending part of herself away to live a normal life. This is the ultimate dissociative defense mechanism, splitting the self to preserve something good while leaving the damaged portion to continue suffering. In clinical terms, this resembles how dissociative identity disorder creates alternate personalities to handle trauma the primary personality cannot process. Except Alessa's split created an entirely separate physical being. The 7 years Alessa spent in hospitals after the burning would have involved extensive medical trauma beyond the initial ritual. Burn treatment is among the most painful medical interventions, involving debridement, skin grafts, and constant wound care. For a 7-year-old to endure this while simultaneously being kept alive through supernatural means for the cult's purposes would create trauma layered upon trauma. Medical PTSD, added to ritual abuse trauma, added to the original burning itself, would fragment anyone's psyche. Alessa's manifestation of the gray children in the elementary school provides insight into her psychological state. These knife-wielding child creatures represent her own lost childhood turned hostile. She was never allowed to be a normal child. Childhood became a state she associated with vulnerability and victimhood. The school, which should be a place of safety and learning, becomes a nightmare realm because Alessa's experience of childhood institutions was consistently traumatic. Her teachers knew about the cult. Her classmates likely participated in her ostracism, and the school itself was complicit in her suffering through silence. The psychological term for what Alessa experienced is complex developmental trauma. Trauma so severe and prolonged during developmental years that it prevents normal personality formation. Alessa never got to develop a stable sense of self because her self was being systematically destroyed by the cult. The person who created the otherworld isn't a functioning individual with a personality disorder. It's the screaming core of a destroyed child who never got to become a person. Alessa's ultimate fate, using her last power to create a purified infant version of herself for Harry to raise, represents both suicide and hope. The Alessa identity was so damaged that continuing it was impossible, but part of her retained enough agency to choose rebirth, to try again with a different life, to salvage something from the wreckage. It's not healing exactly, it's replacement, acknowledging that she was damaged beyond repair and the only solution was starting over as someone else. Travis Grady. Dissociation as Defense. Travis Grady's journey in Silent Hill. Origins reveals a protagonist dealing with childhood trauma, maternal psychosis, and what might be dissociative identity disorder manifesting as the Butcher, discovering his mother Helen attempting to murder-suicide them both when he was young, then finding his father's suicide the next day. Travis experienced compounded trauma that fractured his ability to maintain an integrated sense of self. Travis's job as a truck driver, constantly moving, never settling, living on the road, suggests avoidant behavior typical of PTSD. People who experience severe childhood trauma often structure their adult lives to avoid stability, intimacy, and anything resembling the domestic situations that triggered their original trauma. Travis isn't driving because he loves the freedom. He's driving because staying still means confronting memories he's spent his life escaping. The Butcher, a massive figure in a bloody apron who appears throughout Travis's journey, may be an external manifestation like Pyramid Head, or it may be Travis's dissociated violent self. The theory that Travis has dissociative identity disorder stems from how the butcher behaves, protecting Travis at times, attacking him at others, moving with purpose that seems both helpful and threatening. In DID, alternate identities can emerge to handle situations the primary personality finds overwhelming, and the butcher could be the part of Travis that can handle violence and protect him from threats. Travis's interactions with the mirror world, his ability to transition between the normal world and the other world using reflective surfaces, demonstrates his dissociative capability. He can slip between realities more easily than other protagonists, suggesting he's had extensive practice dissociating from uncomfortable realities. For someone with childhood trauma, dissociation becomes a practice skill, an escape mechanism used so frequently that moving between mental states becomes almost automatic. The maternal psychosis Travis witnessed creates its own psychological legacy. Children who witness a parent's mental breakdown often develop hypervigilance around their own mental stability, constantly monitoring themselves for signs of inherited illness. Travis may carry not just trauma from his mother's suicide attempt, but persistent anxiety that he's one bad day away from experiencing similar psychotic breaks. His saving of Alessa, a child endangered by her mother's actions, might represent an attempt to rewrite his own childhood, to save the child he was by saving a different child in similar circumstances. Travis exhibits symptoms of depression, PTSD, possible dissociative identity disorder, and the complicated grief that comes from traumatic loss of both parents in childhood. His rescue of Alessa places him at the center of events that will echo through the entire franchise, suggesting that even his attempt to do good is contaminated by the town's power to twist intention into catastrophe. Alex Shepard, false memory and military delusion. Alex Shepard returns to his hometown in Silent Hill, homecoming believing he's a combat veteran on leave, searching for his missing younger brother Joshua. The revelation that Alex was never in the military, that his entire military career is a false memory constructed to escape the guilt of accidentally killing Joshua, demonstrates how trauma can cause the mind to construct elaborate alternative histories. The psychiatric term for what Alex experiences is dissociative amnesia with dissociative fugue. He doesn't just forget killing Joshua. His mind constructs an entirely different life story to fill the void where those memories should be. The military background gives him a sense of identity, competence, and purpose that his actual life lacked. It's not malingering or conscious deception. Alex genuinely believes he's a soldier because his psyche needed that belief to function after Joshua's death. Alex's combat behavior throughout the game reveals the paradox of his delusion. He handles weapons with reasonable competence and moves through combat situations with some effectiveness, despite never having received military training. This suggests that his false memories may have created actual skill through psychological preparation, the mind's belief in being a soldier creating soldier-like responses. Alternatively, Silent Hill's supernatural influence may be granting him the abilities his delusion claims he has, making his false identity temporarily real. The Shepard family's dynamics reveal the environmental factors in Alex's disorder. His parents always favored Joshua, showing minimal affection toward Alex because they designated Joshua as the child who would be sacrificed in the town's covenant. Alex grew up in a home where his existence was treated as secondary, where parental coldness was a deliberate strategy to protect themselves from attachment to a child they expected to lose. This emotional neglect created vulnerabilities in Alex's psyche that made him susceptible to constructing false memories when actual trauma occurred. When Joshua actually dies, not in the planned sacrifice, but in an accident caused by Alex, the parents can't adjust. They've spent years preparing to lose Joshua in a specific way, and losing him differently breaks their coping mechanism. Their treatment of Alex afterward, coldness mixed with unprocessed grief, creates the conditions where Alex's mind constructs the military delusion. If he was a soldier away on deployment, he wasn't responsible for Joshua's death. If he was serving his country, he was worthy, despite his parents' neglect. Alex likely has major depressive disorder stemming from childhood emotional neglect, PTSD from Joshua's death, even though the memory is buried, dissociative amnesia, and possibly the beginnings of dissociative identity disorder with the military persona serving as an elaborate alter identity. The town's supernatural influence catches Alex in a web where his false memories collide with actual events, forcing him to integrate a truth his psyche has worked desperately to avoid. Murphy Pendleton, Trauma, Guilt, and the Trap of Vengeance. Murphy Pendleton arrives in Silent Hill, downpour carrying both PTSD from his son Charlie's murder and fresh trauma from having killed the wrong man in retaliation. The revelation that Murphy murdered Patrick Napier, believing him to be Charlie's killer, only to discover later that Frank Coleridge actually killed his son, creates a complex guilt structure. Grief for his son, guilt for killing an innocent man, and rage toward the actual killer he can't reach. Murphy's psychological state at the game's beginning shows trauma responses consistent with prolonged grief disorder, the pathological extension of normal grief when a loss cannot be processed. Charlie's murder was the defining trauma of Murphy's life, and his inability to process that loss drove him to seek vigilante justice. The murder of Napier, rather than providing closure, added a new layer of trauma because Murphy now carries both victim and perpetrator identities simultaneously. The prison transport crash that brings Murphy to Silent Hill represents both literal and psychological transition. In transit between facilities, Murphy exists in liminal space, not quite imprisoned, not quite free. This liminality parallels his psychological state, not quite bereaved father, not quite murderer, unable to settle into any stable identity because every identity he tries carries unbearable aspects. Silent Hill's manifestations for Murphy reflect his guilt and fear of judgment. The void, a spreading darkness that consumes everything, represents the way Murphy's guilt threatens to overwhelm his entire identity. It's not just that he feels bad about what he did. The guilt is actually eroding his sense of self, leaving nothing behind. The boogeyman that pursues Murphy serves as externalized self-punishment, similar to Pyramid Head for James, but more explicitly focused on judgment and execution. Murphy's interactions with Anne Cunningham, who blames him for her father Frank's injuries, force Murphy to confront how his actions created ripples of suffering beyond his intended targets. Frank Coleridge, the actual killer of Charlie, was paralyzed in Murphy's attack despite being Murphy's intended target. Anne's vendetta against Murphy mirrors Murphy's vendetta against Napier, demonstrating the cycle of trauma and retaliation that PTSD can generate when left untreated. The diagnosis here would include PTSD from Charlie's murder, complicated grief, major depressive disorder, and the intense moral injury that comes from realizing you've killed an innocent person. Moral injury differs from PTSD in that it's not fear-based but ethical damage, injury to one's sense of self as a moral being. Murphy experiences not just trauma, but the fundamental knowledge that he's become the kind of person he would have condemned before Charlie's death. Murphy's various endings suggest different resolution paths for his trauma. In endings where he achieves redemption, he's found a way to integrate his actions into a coherent identity without being destroyed by guilt. In darker endings, the guilt and trauma consume him entirely, demonstrating how untreated PTSD and moral injury can lead to complete personality disintegration or death. Henry Townsend, passive observer as psychological defense. Henry Townsend in Silent Hill 4. The Room presents a unique case, a protagonist whose primary psychological characteristic is detachment. Trapped in his apartment for 5 days before the supernatural elements become apparent, Henry exhibits a passive, almost dissociated response to his imprisonment that suggests either profound psychological resilience or deep-seated avoidant personality traits. Henry's extreme isolation, living alone, no meaningful social connections evident, content to remain in his apartment even before being trapped, suggests schizoid personality disorder, characterized by emotional coldness, detachment from social relationships, and restricted emotional expression. Henry doesn't seem particularly distressed by his isolation. He's more puzzled than panicked. When he finally escapes into the other worlds through the bathroom hole, his reactions are muted, observations rather than expressions of fear. This emotional flattening could be adaptive or pathological. It's adaptive in that Henry's ability to remain calm in nightmare scenarios allows him to function and survive where more reactive personalities might break down. It's pathological in that his disconnection from normal emotional responses suggests he's already dissociated before the supernatural events begin. The apartment itself might represent Henry's psychological state, locked in, isolated, cut off from the world, with only observation of others' lives through the peephole, rather than participation in his own. Henry's relationship with Eileen Galvin, his neighbor in room 303, demonstrates his interpersonal difficulties. Despite living next door for some time, they barely know each other. Henry observes her through walls and the peephole, but never initiated contact before the crisis. When forced to work with her in the second half of the game, he's protective but emotionally distant, functioning more as guardian than partner. This inability to form meaningful emotional connections, even under life-threatening circumstances, suggests significant attachment difficulties. The apartment's gradual corruption, walls bleeding, darkness spreading, the safe space becoming hostile, mirrors how depression or anxiety disorders can transform even formerly safe environments into sources of distress. For Henry, the one place that represented his controlled, isolated existence becomes invaded by the supernatural, removing his ability to retreat into detachment as a coping mechanism. Henry likely has schizoid personality disorder, possibly major depressive disorder given his isolated lifestyle, and demonstrates dissociative tendencies that allow him to observe horror with unusual emotional distance. His survival depends not on overcoming psychological issues, but on his pre-existing emotional disconnection serving as armor against the psychological warfare Silent Hill typically wages. Lisa Garland, complicit suffering and self-medication. Lisa Garland's story across Silent Hill and Silent Hill Origins demonstrates how complicity in others' suffering creates its own traumatic load. As a nurse caring for Alessa in Alchemilla Hospital, Lisa was aware of the cult's abuse but felt powerless to intervene. Her relationship with Dr. Kaufman, who provided her with PTV, a hallucinogenic drug, shows the common pattern of medical professionals self-medicating to cope with traumatic working conditions. Lisa exhibits symptoms of substance use disorder, specifically dependence on PTV provided by Kaufman. Her addiction stems from what might be called moral distress, the psychological damage that occurs when someone must regularly participate in or witness actions they believe are wrong but feel unable to prevent. Nurses in abusive medical situations often develop depression, anxiety, and substance abuse as coping mechanisms, and Lisa demonstrates all three. When Lisa realizes in Silent Hill that she herself is dead, that she's been a manifestation or ghost throughout Harry's journey, her breakdown demonstrates the horror of fragmented identity. She experiences what might be called existential death awareness, the moment of recognizing she's no longer alive, never was in the form Harry encountered. This realization causes immediate disintegration of her form, suggesting her maintained identity depended on self-deception about her own status. Lisa's hands transforming, blood seeping from wounds that shouldn't exist, demonstrate how her guilt over failing Alessa manifests physically. In life, she could compartmentalize and dissociate from her complicity through drug use. In death, maintaining that dissociation becomes impossible. The blood on her hands isn't metaphorical. It's the literal manifestation of her guilt made visible. Lisa likely suffered from major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, and substance use disorder during life. Her death doesn't bring peace, but instead traps her in a nightmare of constant awareness of her failure, suggesting that in Silent Hill's cosmology, suicide doesn't end psychological suffering, but rather removes the coping mechanisms that made that suffering bearable. Claudia Wolfe, Religious Delusion and Childhood Indoctrination. Claudia Wolfe in Silent Hill 3 represents what happens when childhood cult indoctrination takes complete hold in a psychologically vulnerable individual. Raised in the order, subjected to its teachings from birth, Claudia genuinely believes birthing God will create paradise. Her psychology demonstrates how religious delusions can be culturally reinforced to the point where they become indistinguishable from sincere faith. Claudia exhibits delusional disorder with religious themes. She's not psychotic in the sense of experiencing hallucinations or losing contact with observable reality. She functions relatively normally in most domains, but her belief in the necessity of birthing God through Heather is unshakable despite evidence against it, meeting the clinical definition of delusion. Fixed false belief not amenable to change in light of conflicting evidence. Her relationship with Vincent Smith, who admits the Order's doctrines may be inventions rather than revelations, shows Claudia's inability to tolerate doubt. When Vincent suggests their God might not be real, Claudia kills him. This isn't anger at betrayal, but elimination of cognitive dissonance. She cannot psychologically tolerate information that challenges her core beliefs, so she removes the source of that challenge. This rigidity is characteristic of delusional disorder. The delusion becomes so central to identity that challenging it feels like an attack on existence itself. Claudia's murder of Harry Mason to trigger Heather's hatred demonstrates how delusional conviction removes empathy. She isn't sadistic or cruel. She's pragmatic within her delusional framework. If hatred makes the God grow faster and birthing God creates paradise, then causing sufficient hatred is not just acceptable, but necessary. This calculation without empathy suggests not just delusion, but personality structure consistent with antisocial features. Ability to harm others without emotional impact because the harm serves a perceived greater purpose. The scene where Claudia swallows the God fetus after Heather rejects it shows the final progression of her delusion. Rather than accept that the plan failed, Claudia becomes the vessel herself. She's willing to suffer the same fate she wanted to inflict on Heather because the delusion is more important than self-preservation. When God emerges from her corpse, it's not the paradise deity she expected, but a twisted, malformed creature, demonstrating how her delusion's promise was always false. Claudia likely has delusional disorder with religious themes, obsessive compulsive personality disorder, given her rigid adherence to order doctrine, and possibly schizotypal personality disorder, if her religious experiences include unusual perceptual experiences. Her psychology demonstrates how childhood indoctrination combined with vulnerable personality traits can create adults who are functional in most domains but completely divorced from reality in specific delusion-supported areas. Dahlia Gillespie. Narcissistic fanaticism. Dahlia Gillespie in Silent Hill represents maternal narcissism weaponized through religious fanaticism. Her burning of her daughter Alessa in a ritual to birth God demonstrates the complete absence of maternal attachment in service of narcissistic supply and cult devotion. Dahlia's psychology reveals how personality disorders can intersect with spiritual belief systems to create monsters who believe themselves holy. Dahlia exhibits narcissistic personality disorder with religious grandiosity. She believes herself chosen, special, the vessel through which God will enter the world, or at least the mother of that vessel. Her daughter is not a person to Dahlia, but an object with function, a tool to achieve her grandiose vision of ushering in paradise. This objectification of her own child demonstrates the profound empathy deficit characteristic of narcissistic personality disorder at its most severe. The manipulation Dahlia performs throughout Silent Hill shows sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, combined with complete absence of ethical constraint. She lies fluently, rebrands the seal of Metatron as the mark of Samael, guides Harry toward completing her ritual while making him believe he's fighting against it. This instrumental use of others, this ability to manipulate without guilt, suggests not just narcissism but psychopathic traits, lack of conscience, shallow affect, and manipulation for personal gain. Dahlia's inability to comprehend failure when the ritual goes wrong demonstrates the narcissistic inability to accept limitations. When Alessa's soul splits and creates Cheryl, when Kaufman's betrayal with Aglaophotis disrupts the birth, Dahlia can't adjust. She continues pursuing the same goal despite changed circumstances because narcissistic individuals cannot tolerate threats to their grandiose self-concept. Admitting failure would mean confronting that she tortured her daughter for nothing, and that recognition is psychologically intolerable. The diagnosis would be narcissistic personality disorder, likely with antisocial and paranoid features. The religious framework isn't delusion. Dahlia's beliefs about Silent Hill's power are largely accurate, but the grandiosity about her own importance within that framework is pure narcissism. She's not a true believer. She's someone who found a belief system that confirmed her pre-existing sense of special importance and used it to justify her complete lack of maternal bond. Laura. Innocence as immunity. Laura in Silent Hill 2 serves as crucial diagnostic evidence for understanding the town's mechanics. As a child who befriended Mary in the hospital, Laura arrives in Silent Hill but experiences none of its horror. She doesn't see the monsters, doesn't experience the otherworld transformations, and functions as though she's in a normal abandoned town rather than a supernatural nightmare realm. Laura's immunity demonstrates that Silent Hill's manifestations require guilt, trauma, or psychological damage to perceive. She's a child without significant trauma, whose worst experiences are normal childhood losses rather than the pathological suffering the adult characters carry. Her ability to navigate Silent Hill safely while remaining completely unaware of its dangers proves the horrors aren't universally present but are observer-specific manifestations. From a psychological perspective, Laura represents the baseline mental health state against which the other character's pathology becomes measurable. She grieves Mary's death, but in a normal, age-appropriate way. She's hurt by Mary's absence, but not destroyed by it. She can be kind or mean to James based on her mood rather than being driven by uncontrollable trauma responses. This normalcy, this psychological flexibility and resilience is exactly what every other character in Silent Hill 2 lacks. Laura's presence also demonstrates the protective factor of developmental innocence. Children can be remarkably resilient in the face of circumstances that would break adults because they haven't yet developed the complex cognitive frameworks that allow for existential dread, moral injury, or the sophisticated self-blame that characterizes adult depression and anxiety. Laura is sad but not traumatized, grieving but not broken, and Silent Hill has no mechanism to harm someone in that state. The diagnosis for Laura is no diagnosis. She's psychologically healthy, experiencing normal grief within normal parameters, demonstrating emotional regulation appropriate to her age and circumstances. She serves as the control group in Silent Hill's psychological experiment, the person whose mental health is intact and who therefore remains untouched by the town's specific horrors. Vincent Smith, the doubt that destroys. Vincent Smith in Silent Hill 3 represents a fascinating case. A cult member who has developed doubt about the cult's core beliefs, but lacks the courage or conviction to act on that doubt. His suggestion to Heather that the monsters she sees might just be people, they looked like monsters to you, reveals someone who has stepped back from complete indoctrination but hasn't committed to genuine rebellion. Vincent likely has generalized anxiety disorder with obsessive rumination. He constantly second-guesses both the Order's doctrine and his own doubts about that doctrine, trapped in a cycle of uncertainty that prevents decisive action. This analysis paralysis is characteristic of anxiety disorders, where the person remains locked in constant evaluation without ever reaching conclusions firm enough to act upon. His manipulation of Heather, giving her the seal of Metatron while calling it protective when it actually triggers the god's birth, shows Vincent's moral ambiguity. He's not purely good or evil, but rather someone whose anxiety and uncertainty make him dangerous in unpredictable ways. He might help, he might harm, depending on which of his competing cognitions wins out at any given moment. Claudia's murder of Vincent suggests she recognized his doubt as threatening. In rigid belief systems, doubt is more dangerous than outright opposition because it spreads, infects, creates cracks in the foundation of shared delusion. Vincent's death at Claudia's hands represents the cult's elimination of cognitive dissonance, the removal of the voice suggesting maybe their entire worldview is constructed rather than divine. Conclusion: the diagnostic mirror. Silent Hill functions as a diagnostic instrument, a psychological assessment tool that identifies and amplifies mental illness in those who enter. The town doesn't create pathology from nothing. It finds existing wounds and makes them manifest. James's depression becomes literal monsters. Angela's trauma becomes literal fire. Eddie's paranoia becomes literal persecution. The town is both therapist and torture chamber, forcing confrontation with psychological content that would otherwise remain internal and escapable. The brilliance of Team Silent's approach to psychological horror lies in their understanding that authentic mental illness is more frightening than supernatural threats alone. The monsters are scary, yes, but what truly disturbs is recognizing the character's psychiatric symptoms, seeing how depression actually looks, understanding how trauma actually functions, watching personality disorders actually operate. These are horror games that require familiarity with diagnostic criteria to fully appreciate, that reward knowledge of psychology with deeper terror. The disorders portrayed across the franchise form a comprehensive psychiatric textbook: major depression, PTSD, complex PTSD, dissociative disorders, personality disorders, psychotic disorders, substance use disorders, and grief complications. The characters aren't abstract symbols but recognizable clinical presentations, people whose symptoms and behaviors align with documented psychiatric conditions. This authenticity makes their suffering tangible, makes their fates matter, makes Silent Hill's horror resonate beyond cheap scares into genuine psychological disturbance. We've walked through the fog with James and his depression, climbed the burning stairs with Angela and her trauma, descended into the meat locker with Eddie and his paranoia, completed the ritual with Walter and his psychotic attachment, integrated identities with Heather and her transferred trauma. Each character demonstrated how mental illness shapes perception, behavior, and fate. Each character showed us a different face of psychological suffering, a different way minds break under pressure. Silent Hill teaches us that horror isn't about jump scares or gore. Horror is depression so severe that you rewrite your own history. Horror is trauma so deep that your world literally burns. Horror is psychosis so complete that you believe a room is your mother. Horror is guilt so overwhelming that you summon your own executioner. Horror is the moment when the mind, pushed beyond its capacity to cope, simply breaks, and you're conscious enough to witness your own fragmentation. The town shows us our wounds. Some characters heal enough to escape. Some are consumed entirely. Some walk into fire or water or darkness, choosing oblivion over continued suffering. But all of them, every single character who enters Silent Hill's fog, teaches us something about the landscape of broken minds, the architecture of trauma, the mechanics of psychological collapse. This is Silent Hill's ultimate truth. The monsters aren't in the fog, they're in the mirror.